For over a century, my family's farm stood as a testament to hard work and resilience. My great-grandfather built it with his own hands, using timber from our land and sweat from his brow. He chose this spot because of the natural spring and fertile soil, perfect for farming. Over the years, the farm became more than just land. It was our legacy, our home. But to the people who moved into the shiny new houses nearby, it was nothing more than an eyesore. They didn't see the history or the heart behind it. All they saw was an obstacle in their way. It started with letters. Official-looking envelopes arrived every Monday, filled with complaints about my farm. The barn, they said, was too tall. The silo, a structure my grandfather had built during the Dust Bowl, was unauthorized. Even the roosters, which had crowed on this land for over 100 years, were suddenly a noise violation. Each letter threatened fines, but I knew they had no legal ground. My farm was exempt from their rules, a fact clearly stated in the original development agreement from the 1990s. Still, the harassment didn't stop. Cynthia Whitmore, the newly elected HOA president, led the charge. She was a retired corporate attorney from Chicago, with perfectly styled hair and a permanent tan from her weekends at the country club. To her, my farm was an inconvenience, a blemish on her vision of a perfect suburban community. She didn't care about the history or the families who depended on the fresh produce we grew. All she cared about was control. I tried to reason with her. I invited her to tour the farm, hoping she'd see its value. I showed her the fields where local schoolchildren planted pumpkins, the lavender fields used for therapy programs, and the irrigation system my grandfather had designed to save the county during droughts. But Cynthia wasn't interested. She wrinkled her nose at the smell of the compost heap and gasped dramatically when a harmless garden snake crossed our path. "This isn't personal, Frank," she said with a cold smile. "We're just upholding community standards." Things escalated quickly after that. A developer, Cynthia's former law partner, showed up at my door with an offer to buy the land. His price was laughably low, and when I refused, his friendly demeanor vanished. "You might want to reconsider," he said, his voice hardening. "Things could get very complicated for stubborn sellers." I didn't take his threat lightly, but I also didn't back down. This land was my family's legacy, and I wasn't about to let them take it. The harassment intensified. Anonymous complaints led to environmental inspectors showing up to investigate non-existent runoff. Animal control was called about my healthy livestock. Every day brought a new challenge, but I held my ground. My attorney, Bill Rodriguez, assured me that their tactics were illegal. We sent a cease and desist letter, which bought us a few weeks of peace. But then the survey stakes appeared along my eastern boundary, marking the fertile section where I grew heirloom tomatoes for local restaurants. That's when I knew they weren't just trying to pressure me. They were preparing to take the land by force. On a Tuesday morning in April, I was delivering produce to Jefferson Elementary when my wife, Martha, called in a panic. "They've got bulldozers at the property line," she said. "They're knocking down the fence. You need to come home now." I abandoned the delivery and raced back, but by the time I arrived, it was too late. The century-old oak fence posts were splintered on the ground, and two yellow bulldozers were advancing toward my barn. Inside that barn were generations of memories. Our antique tractor, the heritage seed collection, and tools my family had used for decades. A crowd had gathered, some watching in horror, others nodding in approval. Cynthia stood behind a police line, smugly holding a leather portfolio. She claimed it contained a legal seizure notice, but I knew it was a forgery. When I tried to stop the destruction, a police officer, later identified as Cynthia's brother-in-law, handcuffed me and forced me into the back of a patrol car. "This is completely illegal," I shouted. "You have no authority here." But no one listened. From the back of the car, I watched as they demolished the barn my great-grandfather had built with his own hands. As the bulldozers tore through the barn, I felt a piece of my soul being ripped away. That barn wasn't just a structure. It was a symbol of everything my family had worked for. My great-grandfather had built it during the Great Depression, using timber he'd harvested from our own woodlot. It had stood for over a century, weathering storms and droughts, only to be destroyed in minutes by people who didn't understand its value. Martha filmed everything, her hands shaking with anger, until they confiscated her phone, claiming she was interfering with official business. What they didn't notice were the security cameras I'd installed weeks earlier, a precaution my attorney had recommended. Those cameras captured everything, including Cynthia's unguarded comment to the bulldozer operator. Make sure you take out that hideous barn completely. We need clear views for the luxury condos. That moment of carelessness would later prove to be her undoing. 6 hours later, they released me without charges because no legitimate charges existed. I returned home to find Martha surrounded by sympathetic neighbors who had brought casseroles and outrage in equal measure. The seizure notice Cynthia had waved around so confidently turned out to be an elaborate forgery on county letterhead. When Bill contacted the county administrator directly, he confirmed what we already knew. This was criminal. They had forged government documents, committed destruction of property, trespassing, and fraud. Bill filed for an emergency injunction while I assessed the devastation. My beloved barn was reduced to splintered heaps, an acre of prime topsoil bulldozed, and wrought iron fencing already installed around what a freshly planted sign proclaimed as the Whitmore Community Dog Park, opening soon. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 9:00 a.m. the following day. Martha and I barely slept that night. The absence of the barn's familiar silhouette against the night sky was a physical ache that kept us tossing and turning. By dawn, we made a pot of strong coffee and laid out our documents across the kitchen table. Deeds, surveys, development agreements, and water rights certificates. These papers were more than just legal documents. They were a paper trail documenting my family's connection to this land, a connection that stretched back further than Cynthia Whitmore had been alive. When we arrived at the county courthouse, we faced not just Cynthia's attorney, but also Judge Walter Phillips, a silver-haired man with a golf tan who we later learned was a regular partner in Cynthia's husband's weekend foursomes at Meadowbrook Country Club. Their legal argument was absurd. They claimed my property had been absorbed into the HOA through adverse possession, despite clear documentation proving otherwise. What they didn't anticipate was my meticulous record-keeping, a habit my father had instilled in me since childhood. As I unfolded the documents on the judge's bench, memories flooded back. My father teaching me to respect these papers more than gold, his weathered hands carefully showing me where each generation had protected our future. I presented the original 1887 deed bearing my great-grandfather's careful signature, the same man who'd escaped poverty in Europe to build something lasting for his family. Next came the water rights certificates from 1912 with official state seals, created during the drought that had claimed 3 neighboring farms but couldn't defeat my grandfather's foresight. Finally, I presented the explicit 1994 development agreement stating my farm would remain independent in perpetuity, with no HOA jurisdiction, signed the year my son was born, when I'd promised him this land would be his legacy too. Most damning, Bill played the security camera footage. The courtroom fell silent as Cynthia's voice rang out clearly. We need clear views for the luxury condos. Her face blanched as she realized her careless words had been captured. Your Honor, my attorney argued, we have video evidence of Ms. Whitmore admitting their true intention is to build luxury condos, not a dog park. This is fraud, trespassing, destruction of property, and abuse of process. Judge Phillips shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that his golf buddy's wife had placed him in an untenable position. He reluctantly granted our temporary injunction, halting further development, but not ordering restoration of my property. Ownership would be determined at trial, he ruled, scheduling proceedings for 3 months later. That evening, reviewing the case with Bill in my farmhouse kitchen, we discovered something that changed everything. Look at this, Bill said, pointing to a clause in the yellowed water rights document my grandfather had filed in 1912 during a devastating drought that had bankrupted many neighboring farms. Your family retained exclusive rights to the aquifer and irrigation system, with conditional easements granted for residential use. The legal language was dense, but its implications were staggering. The document granted my family continued control over water access to what eventually became the entire subdivision. The easements were conditional upon respecting property boundaries and agricultural priority use, conditions Cynthia and her bulldozers had flagrantly violated. My grandfather always said the water system would protect us, I whispered, memories flooding back of him showing me the underground pipes and cisterns as a boy. I never understood exactly what he meant until now. Bill's eyes widened as he grasped the full potential of our discovery. Frank, this is incredible. Your grandfather didn't just build an irrigation system. He legally established the area's first private water utility before modern regulations existed. And the documents show something even more powerful. He pointed to a clause in faded ink. The contract specifically states that if your agricultural rights are ever violated, you can terminate all water access with just 30 days' notice. No questions asked, no court approval needed. When Meadowbrook was built, they had connected to my system instead of extending county lines to save money. That $1 million shortcut was about to become their worst nightmare. The next morning, Bill filed discovery requests demanding all communications between the HOA board and any developers regarding my property. The emails we received revealed the full scope of their scheme. Messages between Cynthia and Skyline developers laid bare their plans. Their proposal wasn't just a dog park. It was phase one of Whitmore Heights, a luxury condominium complex with a private clubhouse and infinity pool, all built on my family's farmland. The old farmer doesn't realize what he's sitting on, Cynthia wrote in one particularly damning email. Once we secure the land, we'll force renegotiation of the water rights or simply have the county condemn them through eminent domain. Either way, the return on investment will be substantial enough to make this worth our while. But Cynthia and her developers had critically miscalculated. The county couldn't override these water rights without due process and just compensation, which would cost millions and take years. By bulldozing my property without legal authority, they had violated the conditional easements that supplied water to their mansions. Frank, Bill said with a slow smile that reminded me of my grandfather's expression when he'd outmaneuvered a cattle buyer trying to lowball him. They just dug their own grave. I stared at the documents, my grandfather's elegant signature at the bottom of each page. He'd been gone for 40 years, but somehow he'd reached across time to protect our land when we needed it most. While our case proceeded through the courts at a glacial pace, Cynthia acted as if victory was assured. Construction crews installed elaborate wrought iron fencing around their new park, expensive teak benches, and decorative dog washing stations appeared overnight. Glossy flyers announced the grand opening of Whitmore Park, a premier community amenity scheduled for the following month. Meanwhile, I consulted with Patricia Kazan, the state's leading water rights attorney, who had defended farmers against corporate interests for 30 years. After reviewing my documentation, she confirmed, "These are among the strongest water rights I've ever seen. Your grandfather was brilliant in how he structured these agreements." The conditional easements required 30 days, written notice before termination, which I immediately filed with the County Water Authority. The notice stated that due to willful easement violations, including destruction of agricultural structures, all residential water easements would terminate in 30 days unless my property was fully restored and damages compensated. Martha and I personally delivered copies to each HOA board member and all 200 households in the subdivision. Some residents slammed doors in our faces. Others listened with growing concern as we explained the situation. A few, mostly the original homeowners who remembered when the development agreements were signed, expressed outright support for our position. Cynthia immediately held an emergency board meeting, dismissing my notice as an empty threat from a desperate old farmer trying to extort the community. "He can't possibly shut off water to an entire community," she assured worried residents, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light as she waved away concerns. "The county will intervene immediately." Her legal experience in corporate takeovers hadn't prepared her for rural water law. Unlike city utilities, these rights predated modern regulations and were specifically protected from government interference. The same county water engineer who had once worked with my grandfather had already privately confirmed my position was unassailable. While awaiting the deadline, I contacted local media with our story and evidence. Investigative reporter Sarah Shawn from the Independent Weekly began digging into Cynthia's connections with Skyline developers and the suspicious approval process for the dog park. Day 31 arrived, the grand opening celebration for Whitmore Park. The park was already operational, with families and their dogs enjoying the new space. Red ribbons had been cut, and residents were exploring the meticulously designed dog play areas with agility equipment, tunnels, and a fancy water station. I put on my work overalls, red plaid shirt, and straw hat, my everyday farm clothes that had seen decades of honest work. With my water rights documentation in hand, I marched directly to the park. Cynthia was there in her powder blue business suit, clipboard in hand, speaking with a small group of HOA members about the successful community initiative. Several dogs ran and played in the sandy enclosure while their owners chatted on the sidelines. "What do you think you're doing on my property?" I demanded, confronting her directly in the middle of the park. My voice carried across the area, causing several people to turn and stare. Cynthia's practiced smile faltered. "Mr. Hardrove, this is now community property. We've been through this." I held up my documentation. "This is still my land, and you know it. You built this park illegally, and those luxury condos you're secretly planning will never happen." She glanced nervously at the other residents. "I don't know what you're talking about. This is just a beautiful community dog park." "Is that so?" I pointed to the residents gathering around us. "Do all of you know that your HOA president is planning to replace this park with condos? That she forged documents to steal my land?" The confrontation grew heated as residents began murmuring among themselves. Some approached with their dogs, creating exactly the scene captured in the photos that would later expose the HOA schemes. "You'll regret this," Cynthia hissed, trying to maintain her composure as her plans began unraveling. "No," I replied firmly. "You will. You have until sundown to recognize my property rights, or every home in Meadowbrook Estates will be without water by morning." I turned and walked away, leaving Cynthia to deal with the increasingly suspicious residents. Hours later, when they ignored my ultimatum, I walked with Martha to the old pump house my grandfather had built from Riverstone during the Depression. Inside stood the control mechanism he had installed, a series of valve wheels and levers that could redirect water flow throughout the system. With Martha filming for documentation, I slowly turned the main valve wheel, redirecting water flow from the residential lines to the agricultural reservoir we used for irrigation. The change wasn't immediately noticeable. Toilets still flushed with water already in their tanks, sinks still ran with residual pressure. But throughout the subdivision, water pressure began dropping steadily. By 2:00 p.m., as the celebration continued, automatic sprinkler systems throughout Meadowbrook sputtered and died. By 4:00 p.m., residents returning home from work discovered upstairs faucets ran dry. By 6:00 p.m., Cynthia's champagne toast at the grand opening was interrupted by urgent texts from residents. "No water at all. Toilets won't flush. Is there a county water main break?" The celebration dissolved into chaos as homeowners rushed home to check their own situations. Emergency vehicles arrived at my farm within the hour, not police cars, but county utility trucks, followed by news vans alerted by residents. The County Water Authority engineer reviewed my documentation and confirmed to the assembled crowd, "Mr. Hardrove is within his legal rights." The conditional easements were clearly violated by the unauthorized seizure of agricultural land. Cynthia's phone call came at 8:00 p.m., her voice shrill with panic and rage. "Turn the water back on immediately. This is illegal." "Actually," I replied calmly, "I followed every legal requirement for terminating easements that were violated by your unauthorized seizure of my property. You have my terms: full restoration of my land, compensation for damages, and binding recognition of my property's independence from HOA jurisdiction. Until then, I suggest you invest in bottled water." By morning, Meadowbrook Estates was in crisis. No showers before work, no toilets flushing, no coffee makers or dishwashers functioning. Pristine lawns were already withering under the summer sun. Swimming pools were stagnating. The community split dramatically, not along the lines Cynthia expected. Rather than uniting against me, many residents directed their anger toward the HOA board that had created this situation. The water shutdown didn't just inconvenience the residents of Meadowbrook Estates, it exposed the cracks in Cynthia's carefully constructed facade. Longtime residents like Jim and Alina Peterson, who had always appreciated the charm of living near a historic farm, organized an emergency community meeting without the board's presence. They invited me to speak directly to their neighbors. The room was packed beyond capacity, with people spilling into the hallway. I didn't come dressed for battle or with practice speeches. I wore my everyday work clothes, clean but well worn, with soil still embedded in the creases of my hands. It was the honest appearance of a farmer who had worked the same land for decades. I didn't come to gloat. I brought documentation showing Cynthia's secret development plans, copies of the fraudulent seizure papers, and video footage of the destruction. Most shocking to residents was the revelation that their HOA dues had funded the illegal operation, potentially making them financially liable. I don't want to punish innocent families, I explained. I just want my farm restored and protected. For 5 generations, we've been good neighbors. We want to continue that tradition. Sarah Shawn's investigative report aired that evening, revealing Cynthia's husband had received stock options in Skyline Developers worth $250,003 days before the bulldozers arrived, a clear conflict of interest never disclosed to residents. Day 3 of the water restriction, petition signatures demanding the board's resignation reached 85% of households. What started as neighbors viewing me as an enemy had transformed into an unexpected alliance. People who had never thought about where their food came from were suddenly defending a farmer's right to his land. County mediator, Judge Elena Ramirez, convened an emergency session on day 5. The hearing room was packed with residents wearing "Save Hardrove Farm" buttons. Cynthia arrived with 3 attorneys from her former law firm. I brought my documentation in simple, non-negotiable terms. After reviewing all evidence, Judge Ramirez addressed the room. In 30 years on the bench, I've rarely seen such a clear case of property rights violation and abuse of HOA authority. Mr. Hardrove's water rights are legally sound and properly exercised following documented easement violations. Turning to Cynthia, she continued, "Mrs. Whitmore, as an attorney, you should understand the serious nature of creating fraudulent legal documents. The court strongly recommends accepting Mr. Hardrove's terms immediately, as criminal charges remain a distinct possibility." The emergency board representatives, elected the previous evening in a contentious community meeting, immediately agreed to my terms. Full property restoration, including rebuilding my historic barn to original specifications, financial compensation for all damages, and a legally binding agreement forever exempting my farm from HOA jurisdiction. As promised, I restored water access the moment the documents were signed. Judge Ramirez personally added a clause prohibiting any future development within 100 feet of my property boundaries, creating a permanent buffer zone that would protect the farm forever. As I walked out of the courthouse, dozens of neighbors approached me, not with anger, but with apologies and offers to help rebuild. In that moment, I realized this conflict had actually strengthened the bond between my farm and the community in ways I never could have imagined. The changes came swiftly. Cynthia resigned and listed her mansion for sale the following week after the district attorney opened an investigation into the fraudulent seizure documents. The county revoked her law license pending the outcome. The new HOA board, headed by Jim Peterson, worked with me to establish the Hardrove Heritage Farm Protection Initiative. Rather than fighting the farm, they embraced it as a community asset. The illegally seized land was restored to agricultural use, with volunteers helping replant the damaged acre with heritage vegetables. Meadowbrook residents raised funds to rebuild my barn using traditional methods and materials. Local craftsmen recreated the hand-hewn beams and distinctive cupola that had made it a local landmark for generations. The new structure included a small agricultural education center where school groups could learn about sustainable farming practices. Most significantly, the community established farm-to-table dinners where residents could enjoy meals prepared with ingredients grown on the very land they had almost lost. These monthly gatherings became so popular that neighboring communities began creating similar partnerships with local farmers. Skyline developers abandoned their condominium plans after their collusion with Cynthia became public. The scandal led to new state legislation strengthening protections for agricultural land, legislation that became known as Hardrove Law. Standing in the rebuilt barn, surrounded by neighbors turned friends, I realized something powerful. The HOA had accidentally united the community around the very farm they tried to destroy. They thought they could bulldoze history with fancy paperwork, but instead learned the lesson my grandfather knew all along. Sometimes, the most powerful rights are hidden in plain sight, quietly waiting generations to protect what matters most. The aftermath of the legal battle brought unexpected changes to Meadowbrook Estates and the surrounding community. What had started as a fight to save my family's farm turned into a movement that redefined how people viewed agriculture, history, and community. The Hardrove Heritage Farm Protection Initiative became a model for other neighborhoods, showing that farms and suburban developments could coexist harmoniously. The new HOA board, led by Jim Peterson, worked closely with me to ensure the farm's future was secure. They established a permanent agricultural easement, legally protecting the land from any future development. This wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone who believed in preserving history and supporting local food systems. The community even voted to allocate a portion of their HOA dues to fund educational programs at the farm, ensuring that future generations would understand the value of sustainable agriculture. The rebuilt barn became a symbol of resilience. Local craftsmen had painstakingly recreated every detail, from the hand-hewn beams to the distinctive cupola that crowned the structure. Inside, we set up an agricultural education center where school groups, families, and even curious residents could learn about farming practices, soil health, and the importance of preserving heritage crops. The barn also housed a small museum showcasing my family's history, complete with old photographs, tools, and stories passed down through generations. One of the most transformative outcomes was the farm-to-table dinners. What began as a small gathering of neighbors eager to make amends quickly grew into a monthly event that attracted people from across the region. Martha and I worked with local chefs to create meals using ingredients grown on the farm. The dinners became a celebration of community, with live music, storytelling, and even cooking demonstrations. People who had once seen my farm as an eyesore now saw it as a treasure, a place where they could connect with the land and each other. The scandal surrounding Cynthia Whitmore and Skyline developers had far-reaching consequences. The district attorney's investigation led to criminal charges against Cynthia for fraud, forgery, and abuse of power. Her husband's involvement in the scheme also came to light, resulting in fines and the forfeiture of the stock options he had received from Skyline. The case became a cautionary tale, prompting state legislators to pass the Hardrove Law, which strengthened protections for agricultural land and imposed stricter regulations on HOAs. Skyline developers, once a powerful force in the region, faced public backlash and financial losses. Their reputation was tarnished, and they were forced to abandon their plans for luxury condos. The land they had intended to develop was eventually sold to a conservation group, ensuring it would remain open space forever. It was a fitting end to their greed-driven scheme. For me, the most meaningful change was the shift in how my neighbors viewed the farm. People who had once complained about the roosters crowing at dawn now brought their children to collect eggs. Families who had never set foot on a farm before spent weekends helping plant crops or harvest vegetables. The farm became a place of learning, healing, and connection. It was a reminder that the land wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone who cared about its future. Martha and I often reflected on how far we'd come. There were moments during the fight when we felt hopeless, when it seemed like the odds were stacked against us. But we held on, not just for ourselves, but for the generations that came before us and the ones that would follow. My grandfather's words echoed in my mind. The land doesn't belong to us. We belong to the land. He had understood that our connection to the soil was deeper than ownership. It was a responsibility, a promise to care for something greater than ourselves. As the years passed, the farm continued to thrive. Our children, now grown, took on more responsibilities, ensuring the legacy would live on. The community's support never wavered, and the farm became a cornerstone of Meadowbrook Estates. Visitors often remarked on the sense of peace they felt when they walked through the fields or sat under the old oak tree near the barn. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, where people could reconnect with nature and themselves. The story of the Hardrove farm spread beyond our community, inspiring others to fight for their own legacies. I received letters from farmers across the country, sharing their struggles and victories. Many of them had faced similar battles with developers, corporations, or even their own neighbors. My story gave them hope, reminding them that they weren't alone and that the fight was worth it. Looking back, I realized that the conflict had been a turning point, not just for me, but for everyone involved. It had forced us to confront difficult questions about progress, preservation, and what it means to be a community. In the end, we found a way to move forward together, honoring the past while building a better future. Years after the legal battle, the Hardrove farm had become more than just a working farm. It was a living testament to resilience, community, and the enduring power of legacy. The barn, once reduced to splinters, now stood proudly as the heart of the farm, its cupola catching the sunlight and its doors open to anyone who wanted to learn or simply enjoy the peace of the countryside. The fields, once threatened by bulldozers, were now lush with crops, tended by hands that carried on the traditions of generations. The farm-to-table dinners had grown into a beloved tradition, drawing people from all walks of life. Each month, the barn was transformed into a vibrant gathering space, filled with laughter, music, and the aroma of fresh, locally grown food. Martha and I often sat at the head of the long wooden tables, watching as neighbors, friends, and strangers shared stories and forged connections. It was a reminder that the farm wasn't just a place. It was a bridge between people, a space where differences faded and common ground was found. The educational programs we launched became a cornerstone of the farm's mission. Schoolchildren visited regularly, their eyes wide with wonder as they planted seeds, fed the animals, and learned about the cycles of nature. Veterans groups came to work in the lavender fields, finding solace and purpose in the rhythm of farm life. Even city dwellers, curious about where their food came from, made the trip to Meadowbrook to experience the farm firsthand. It was a joy to see the land my great-grandfather had chosen for its natural spring and rich soil become a source of inspiration and healing for so many. Cynthia Whitmore's downfall had been swift and public. The legal consequences of her actions had left her reputation in ruins, and she had quietly moved away, leaving behind the mansion she had once ruled from. The scandal had also prompted a broader reckoning within Meadowbrook Estates. The new HOA board, led by Jim Peterson, worked tirelessly to rebuild trust and ensure that the community's priorities aligned with the values of its residents. Transparency and accountability became the guiding principles, and the farm was celebrated as a symbol of what could be achieved when people came together. The Hardrove Law, named in honor of my family's fight, had a lasting impact far beyond our community. It set a precedent for protecting agricultural land across the state, ensuring that farmers had the legal tools to defend their livelihoods and legacies. I often received letters from other farmers, thanking me for standing up and sharing their own stories of resilience. It was humbling to know that our struggle had sparked a movement, one that would safeguard the land for generations to come. As I walked through the fields one evening, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and pink, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. The farm had survived against all odds, not because of me alone, but because of the countless people who had stood by our side. From Martha, who had been my rock through every challenge, to Bill Rodriguez, whose legal expertise had been invaluable, to the neighbors who had rallied around us when it mattered most. It had been a collective effort. My grandfather's words echoed in my mind as I paused by the old oak tree near the barn. The land doesn't belong to us. We belong to the land. He had understood that our connection to the soil was a sacred bond, one that required care, respect, and stewardship. Standing there, with the scent of freshly turned earth in the air and the sound of crickets chirping in the distance, I felt that bond more strongly than ever. The farm was more than just a piece of property. It was a living, breathing entity, shaped by the hands of my ancestors and now by the hands of my children and grandchildren. It was a place where history and hope intertwined, where the past was honored and the future was nurtured. And as long as there were people willing to fight for it, the farm would endure. Martha joined me by the oak tree, her hands slipping into mine. We stood in silence, watching as the first stars appeared in the evening sky. The farm was quiet now, the day's work done, but there was a sense of life all around us. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the soft hum of the earth itself. It was a reminder that the land was alive, and so was the legacy we had fought so hard to protect. As we turned to walk back to the house, I glanced over my shoulder at the barn, its silhouette dark against the fading light. It stood as a testament to the strength of family, the power of community, and the enduring spirit of those who refused to give up. The fight had been long and hard, but it had been worth it. The farm was safe, the legacy was secure, and the future was bright. And in that moment, I knew that my great-grandfather would be proud.